This has got to end. This is causing inflation. I mean, this is hurting the poorest families. It's not hurting the rich. It's hurting families like mine growing up. They have struggled to put food on the table with this ridiculous inflation. Solve that. We've got to live within our means like every family does.
But, Senator, you talk about living within your means. You talk about the debt. You talk about deficits. The Trump tax cuts, which were passed in 2017, the year before you were elected to the Senate, is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office that it is going to increase the deficit by over $2 trillion over 11 years. So should the Trump tax cuts be repealed?
My experience is I cut taxes and fees 100 times, over $10 billion, and I actually balanced a budget and paid off a third of the state debt. You can do both. The way you do it is you look at every line of your budget. I think there's about 4,000 lines of the Florida budget. I went through every line and said, I am not going to waste anybody's money. We've got to do that at the federal level.
But sir,
we need lower taxes.
But sir,
and watch how we spend our money.
When Donald Trump was president, you had this tax cut, which added $2 trillion to the deficit, according to the CBO, and you didn't have the commensurate spending cuts. So the question is, if you're not going to have the spending cuts, should you repeal the tax cuts if the debt and deficit are so vital?
Well, first off, I am not raising anybody's taxes. I want lower taxes. I want to watch how we spend our money. I've been in the Senate now 2 years and 9 months. The amount of waste is staggering. Americans should be furious with the way money is spent in the Senate and in all Congress. It's your money. It's not government's money. We've got to figure out how to live within our means. I did it at the state level and actually paid off a third of state debt. We've got to look at every line, take every line of the budget. Don't say, well, that's only $1 billion. It's $1 billion. That's a lot of money. We should watch how we spend every dollar.
If you'd just woken up from a coma and wanted to know whether a Democrat or a Republican was in office, all you'd need is 3 minutes on Fox News to hear whether every member of the GOP was wailing about the deficit or the debt or inflation. Because here we are, after Republicans added $7.8 trillion to the debt while their guy was in office, and yet now that Biden's president, the right is running around like chickens with their heads cut off because they've miraculously rediscovered the concept of fiscal responsibility. Yeah, no, that totally checks out. Now, before we get into the main focal point here regarding inflation, just one point that's worth bringing up when it comes to this whole song and dance by Rick Scott. He starts off this episode of Pearl Clutching by saying this is, quote, hurting families like mine growing up that have struggled to put food on the table. Just so you're aware of who Rick Scott is, while parading himself around like this voice for the little guy, he oversaw what was the largest healthcare fraud case in U.S. history when, as CEO of Columbia HCA Hospital, his company billed Medicare, Medicaid, and other federal programs for tests that were never offered, attached false diagnosis codes to patient records to increase reimbursements to the hospitals, claimed non-reimbursable advertising costs as community education, and billed the government for home visits for patients that didn't qualify to receive them. The hospital company was fined a staggering $1.7 billion, which was, at that point, the largest healthcare fraud fine ever levied by the Justice Department. And Rick Scott, trying to escape accountability, resigned as CEO fewer than 4 months after the investigation became public. So while he tries to paint himself as this noble figure, just remember that he stole money from Medicare and Medicaid, programs that service the elderly, the poor, the disabled, and the sick, so that he could line his pockets as the CEO. This is who Rick Scott is. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Now, as far as inflation's concerned, is there inflation? Of course there is. Let's just think for a moment about why there would be rising prices right now. Inflation's risen to about 5.4% year over year, but last year, the economy was shut down, demand for many services and goods plummeted, companies laid off employees, and they cut their prices. And now that the economy is reopening, prices are back up to account for a constrained supply as supply chains work to hit their peak efficiency again. This is not some inexplicable five-alarm fire. This is a short-lived phenomenon where the economy will adjust and year-over-year benchmarks will become less volatile than the summer of 2020 when the whole world was shut down to the summer of 2021 when the whole world began to reopen. 5.4% inflation from where there was no business is not some shocking revelation, and in fact what would be more surprising is if that wasn't the case. So I get that Republicans are hammering away at inflation because they think it's an effective way to scare people, but anyone with even a basic understanding of economics would A, expect inflation inflation after a phenomenon like the pandemic, and B, recognize that it's only transitory. And of course, Rick Scott and the rest of his party know that, but they are banking on the fact that their supporters don't. They are relying on their supporters' ignorance so that they can misrepresent a process that began under and was exacerbated by a Republican administration, as if it somehow started under Joe Biden. Their entire strategy is predicated on lying to the people who trust them. If Republicans were actually concerned about inflation, you'd think they'd have made a little more of an effort to actually rein in this pandemic. If the virus was actually contained and the whole economy didn't have to shut down for as long as it did because half the country took their anti-science cues from their elected officials, things might not have been as bad. But instead, Republicans opted to oppose masks and stay-at-home orders and vaccines and mandates. They encouraged this virus to spread. They prolonged the pandemic, which continued to wreak havoc on the economy. And then they had the audacity to turn around and clutch their pearls when that same economy doesn't bounce back right away. It is manufactured outrage to an embarrassing degree. And finally, one last point. When Chris Wallace confronts Rick Scott on his whole fiscal conservatism shtick and asks if the Trump tax cuts that added a staggering $2 trillion to the debt should be repealed, Scott delves into some tortured response about line-item budget cuts and waste in Congress, all of which underscores the fact that of course he wouldn't undo those tax cuts because they help him. This isn't about the debt or the deficit or inflation. This is about Rick Scott using those things as a cudgel against Democrats. But when he's posed with an actual solution, he backtracks all the way back into the parking lot because it won't unilaterally help him and his own bank account. What everyone should understand is what people like Rick Scott are showing by their every action. They will avail themselves of every tactic possible to scare you into doing what's best for them. They are not in it to help you, they are in it to help themselves. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.